other comment happening? I can't hear you.
Yes, I wanted to say something.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yes. So before we go ahead, I had. Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yeah, yes, but you have to be a bit louder. Jaldi, be a bit louder.
Okay. Yes. So I had a couple of questions. Actually, two questions. The first is, do we see an influence of rationalist ideas in Emile Zola?
Rationalist?
Yes.
Actually, rationalism and empiricism seems to have, at that debate seems to have settled with Kant. And it's part of scientific methodology. Both aspects are required, not just rationalist thinking in a logical, systematic manner and abstract mathematical manner, but also in terms of empirical observation and data. So scientific method seems to have now been consolidated in positivism, though the emphasis remains on empiricism very often in positivist thought. But experimentation is one of the important methodological, what should I say, not development, but idea of scientific method. And that connects to his scientific or experimental novel, the idea of experimental novel, right? So it's not merely rationalist, it's both empiricist and rationalist.
All right. Yes, I get it.
But scientific rationality or scientific reasoning is important to scientific thought, right? That is the basis of scientific thought.
Right.
Yeah. So rationalism in old Descartesian sense of the term of using only your thinking to get knowledge is now, I think, obsolete by the time you reach 19th century. Right? Descartes is almost what, 16th century, right? So almost 300, 200 years after that, scientific, and there is industrial revolution that is raging, which is often mostly drawing upon scientific knowledge of the 17th century, the Newtonian science, right? Which is the basis of 19th century industrial revolution. That is something very important. Yeah. What is your other question?
No, my other question just kind of got resolved. It was the fact that do we see, like we see, that I thought we saw rationalist ideas in Zola. Do we see empiricist ideas in James? But that kind of just got resolved.
Yes, but his whole idea of experience in Henry James is not, is more of phenomenal world that Kant is talking about, in a sense that it's not merely empiricism. It goes beyond that, because what James suggests is that your experience is something which allows you to understand the whole from the pattern or whole from the part, right? So if you see a girl crying on the street, then you imagine based on your own understanding of life and the world to the whole sequence of incident that led her to crying on the street, and then you come up with a novel. Then that's how, right? I hope you get what I'm saying. So even if it has something to do with observation, it also relies on experience, which is like a cobweb, right, which spreads out from one point to 100 other points. So that's James' theory. So it's not purely empirical either, right? So imagination, which is a producer of symbolic thought in Coleridge, right? Here it is experience that is a kind of part-whole relation of metonymy or synecdoche, right? Based on the contiguity and part-whole relationship. Metonymy tells us about physical connectivity, like hand pen is mightier than sword, by which you mean that a person who holds that pen is mightier than a person who holds a sword, right? So it's not a symbol, but it's like a metonymy or synecdoche, where part stands for whole, while in metonymy it is connection. And both are very similar devices, right? So you should be able to figure out whole thing on basis of your observation of something which is there in front of you. So it's empiricism, but not empiricism. Does that answer your question in some way, Jaldi?
Yes, it does. Yes.
So that has brought us to symbolism, right? And if you look at all isms that we have been discussing, naturalism, realism, neoclassicism, romanticism. So what do you make of the term symbolism, looking at the suffix ism?
That maybe this literary trend took up to Coleridge's ideas of representing of symbols representing in nature something of a higher form, and then this whole movement was surrounded near this idea. That tendency was invoked basically.
Right, like Coleridge's idea of some things in natural world standing for something else, right? The other world, the higher world. So there is a correspondence between this world and that world. But what is important here, you are right, symbol becomes a principle of creativity that is to be upheld. Just like realism insists, it's a principle that art should reflect or represent reality accurately. That's one of the underlying principles of realism. And this principle is upheld, and it's a kind of movement where you're trying to promote and propagate these principles of realism, right? And naturalism upholds the idea that the entire life and world is driven by natural forces and causes rather than supernatural worlds and supernatural powers and causes. So it's a naturalism, right? But symbolism implies that art should be symbolic, right? Art is symbolic. That's the principle of symbolism, which is being upheld. And symbolism is in some way continuation of romanticism in the domain of poetry. That is very important. So while in the domain of prose and fiction, you are having naturalism in France, almost parallelly in domain of poetry, you have symbolism. However, symbolism can also be understood as a rejection or negation of realism, right? And that is very important. And in what way is it a rejection of realism is what we are going to discuss. One of the underlying idea of symbolism is that language, right, is symbolic. It's not primarily referential, because an underlying idea of realism was that words and the things that they refer to have a kind of natural referential connection. I hope I'm clear that if I use the word dog, then it refers to that animal, and this relation between the dog and the animal is the word dog, and the animal that you see is a transparent one, right? So it's a referential understanding of language, that language reflects reality or is connected to reality in a transparent way. That's the underlying assumption of realism, that if I describe morning, then that description of morning is realistic. That means the representation is accurate, photographic kind of replica of morning that you have experience, right? So realism is based on the notion that language is essentially referential. Symbolism holds that language is essentially symbolic. Means word dog stands for another entity, a different entity, other than that word that I'm using. Right? So there is a difference between looking at the word dog and that animal. It's not a natural, direct connection, but A standing for X. You get what I'm saying? The difference between symbolism view of language and yes, Tavan. Yes, Tavan, very much. So symbolism anticipates structuralism and post-structuralism. In fact, these people, the whole group of French poets, Baudelaire, Charles Baudelaire, Stephen Mallarmé, Paul Valéry, all given on page 489. Arthur Rimbaud, these are some of the greatest poets of modern times. Along with Charles Baudelaire and their followers like Jules Laforgue, Gustave Kahn are some of the most important and influential poets of modern period, right? So structuralism is using the idea given by symbolist people in the domain of theory. This is where you have to differentiate. Just like naturalism used ideas of science in creative writing, symbolism is using these ideas in the domain of creative writing. Criticism, which is very a kind of different domain, right, uses symbolics idea after structuralism by Ferdinand de Saussure and others, right, and post-structuralism. Page 489 onwards, Pooja. And Jaldi, exactly so. This is a turn towards Platonicism. Right? So both of you are exactly on your marks. So these set of poets that we have mentioned had their parallels in pre-Raphaelite movement in Britain, right? Where this group of painters like Christina Rossetti and Dante Gabriel Rossetti, these are brothers and sisters, very famous duo. They wanted, and the painters surrounding them, they believed in going back to pre-Renaissance medieval art practices or art ideologies of art. And that's why they are called pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. It was formed in 1848, page 489. Next, let's tell you an important question. Okay. But the French school called symbolism poets influenced the later modernist poets in a big way. In fact, T.S. Eliot's theory of objective correlative is a kind of modernist version of symbolism, right? W.B. Yeats, of course, Marcel Proust, James Joyce, Virginia Woolf were influenced by the symbolist movement. And Jacques Derrida, Julia Kristeva, structuralists were all influenced by the ideas of Stephen Mallarmé primarily. So on page 490, you learn that one of the French writers, Jean Maurier, he wrote the first manifesto of symbolism. And he reacted against realism and naturalism, right? This is also something very important. And he is also critiquing the school of French poetry called Parnassian poetry, which holds that language should be very precise and accurate. You can't be ambiguous and ambivalent in your language. So language should be very, very precise is the basic principle of Parnassian school of poetry. So Mallarmé's important book called Divergences. I don't know how to pronounce it. People who study French can tell me how to pronounce it. कोई बता सकता है मुझे? जिनको French सीख रहे हैं वो जानते हैं वो. How do you pronounce this? Divergences. Page number 490. First paragraph. Anna is not keeping well, right? Has she recovered? Okay.
No, sir, she's still in the hospital.
God. She's doing better. Okay. Okay, anyway. So what Mallarmé rejects is this referential idea of language, right? And that it's not that there is reality out there and language reflects it. It's a kind of transparent instrument which reflects reality, right? Instead of that, language is something that produces reality, something that goes into the heart of modern thinking about language, right down from structuralism to Heidegger and post-structuralists and new historicists and Foucault. All these seem to follow this theory of language, that language is not a reflection of reality which is existing independently of language, but it's the language that produces our reality. So it's like that this word stands for dog is actually something that brings that animal into existence for us. That's the theory that Mallarmé proposed. And he insisted that meanings do not pre-exist language or in the mind of the author. So he's also attacking the romantic theory of art, which says that मेरे दिमाग में feelings और दिल में feelings है, ideas है दिमाग में, I express them in language, right? So expressive theories of art that you find in the Romanticism are being criticized by Mallarmé. He says that it's the language that precedes thought. No, not exactly. Okay. There does seem to be a hint of tabula rasa, but you know, tabula rasa goes to Locke's theory, and which says that mind is blank slate and it's formed by associations through several experiences, empirical experiences. So once you see something for several times, then you get the category or the idea or the concept of what you have. That's John Locke's theory of language and mind. But this is not what he is saying. He's saying something else. What he's saying is that language is the bearer of meaning, and you cannot have thoughts and emotions before language. I hope you get what I'm saying. They come through language. Does that make any sense, or is it difficult to understand? Like a priori knowledge independent of experience? No. What Mallarmé is saying, that language is a symbolic order, right? And your thinking cannot precede language. So there is no such thing as non-linguistic thought in your mind, which you later on express in words. Right? So language is not an expressive medium, but it's a symbolic medium. That means if I tell you I am feeling sad, right? So it's not that the thought without language came first into my mind. Because to think that I am sad I spoke to myself something called thought, thinking, right? आप अपने आप को कहते हो कि मैं बहुत दुखी हूँ, वो वर्ड लैंग्वेजिंग होता है और फिर बाद में आप उसे एक्सप्रेस करते हो। तो ऐसे नहीं है कि सोच पहले आती है और भाषा बाद में आती है, भाषा और सोच दोनों एक साथ आते हैं। सोचना भाषा के बगैर मुमकिन नहीं है, राइट? राइट स्तवन? Language is a condition for thought and meaning.
So,
Yeah.
language as the origin or the condition? Because he seems to suggest that language is the origin of thought.
Means without language, can you think?
I don't know, but this seems complicated because then how would deaf and dumb people communicate, or how would deaf and dumb people think? But
Because language is not merely words. And very interestingly, they think through signs, symbols. Symbols.
exactly.
Very, very good question. You know, this theory is also been challenged recently by a school of linguistics called cognitive linguistics and embodied thinking. And they argue that neurological basis of brains, right, have a greater role to play in construction of meanings and experience and perceptions. That's the cognitivist theory of language and meaning that some people like George Lakoff and Mark Turner and many of their followers follow. But that's an aside. But what he is saying is that it's a symbolic system, right? He doesn't use that word. And so human being enters this symbolic system in order to articulate meaning, articulate language, right? And this anticipates structuralism and post-structuralist thought. This is the cornerstone of structuralism and post-structuralism for all of you.
So, is he advocating symbolism or is he not?
He is advocating symbolism, right?
Right. Yeah.
And he goes on to argue that even human subjectivity जैसी कोई चीज है ही नहीं, because language contains what you want to say, what you want to think. So he advocated impersonality theory of poetry. And both these ideas would be again cornerstone of T.S. Eliot's theory of poetry that we will discuss, right? And he ran into a kind of controversy with scholars like Remy de Gourmont, who was a critic of symbolist movement. And he says that only mediocre works are impersonal. And pure art is actually concerned exclusively with self-realization. And you can see how romanticism is also something that is, so in some ways symbolists are using romantic ideas to criticize romanticism, right? So that is very interesting. Yeah. It was made extremely popular in English language, this symbolist movement, by a very important book called The Symbolist Movement in Literature by Arthur Symons. Let us not go into that right now. स्तवन, तो मुझे पूरी तरह से दूसरी जगह पे ले जाएगा. Okay. So don't, because if I go into that, it will take me 1 month to teach you what is logocentrism. So leave that behind right now. Okay, coming back to our, but what, Stavan, you have to keep in mind that post-structuralism, like Derrida's, and structuralism is influenced by Mallarmé and the symbolist poets. This is how poets come before criticism, right? Some of the key principles of literary criticism you find being articulated by poets. And Derrida wrote extensively on Mallarmé as well, right? Okay. This book, The Symbolist Movement in Literature, 1889, is a landmark book in English. It influences later English poetry, especially poetry of W.B. Yeats and others. And he describes symbolist movement as revolt against exteriority, against rhetoric, against materialist traditions on page 490. Symbolist literature is in some way critique of the earlier schools of romanticism as well as realism. This emphasis on the materialist dimension of language is also something that is emphasized by Derrida, right? So how Mallarmé anticipates Derrida. Again, like Zola, we have to keep in mind, Mallarmé क्या कह रहा है वो कविता और साहित्य के बारे में है. सशोर और Derrida जो कह रहे हैं वो थियोरी के बारे में. There is a difference between theory and creative writing, something which Oscar Wilde will go on to subvert later on.
Sir,
Yeah.
if you don't mind, can you please repeat Mallarmé's theory? I'm not quite clear about it.
Okay, so what Mallarmé is saying, it's written here, right? Page 490, first paragraph. Most fundamentally, Mallarmé rejected the idea on which realism was premised, that language was referential, that words were somehow signs of a pre-given reality. A reality is an interpretation from a particular perspective, and for Mallarmé, poetry is part of that reality, and indeed helps to create that reality. So what he is saying that language creates the world, and it's possible to create other worlds through language, right? So it's not that reality pre-exists language, which means when did the idea of can God pre-exist the idea of or the word God? So until and unless you have a word called God, you cannot think about God, right? Yes, no? So the invention of word God and God is simultaneous. Does that make any sense, Jaldi?
Yes, sir, maybe a little bit. Yes.
And again, I will give you one more example that will clarify things. How is that possible, Jalta? Idea of God kaise? Comes after the word God, right? Or even simultaneously. You cannot separate idea from the word, Jalta. But let's take another more everyday example to clarify what you mean. I will come to that. Imagine a tribe in deep African jungle, right? Which does not know any technology that you are, which is part of your everyday life, like cell phone, smartphone. Now, if that person, if you go there and if you show that, and therefore in that tribe, the language that they use has no word for smartphone or telephone or anything, no synonyms, no word for smartphone. Now you go to that place and show a person from that tribe your smartphone. तो उसे क्या दिखेगा? Do you get my question? Imagine a tribe living in deep jungles of Africa who are not exposed to technology like we have. And वो Black Panther वाली बात नहीं कर रहा हूँ मैं, right? Poor African tribe in who has not seen any technology. If you go there and show them your cell phone, what will they see? What will they see? Will they see the smartphones, Tavan?
A magic machine, probably.
So they should have a word called machine, a concept called machine. वो होना चाहिए. मान लो उनके पास ऐसा कोई कॉन्सेप्ट ही नहीं है मशीन का, तो क्या कहेंगे वो?
God, maybe.
Huh? What will they
Maybe.
see?
Maybe some divine divine tool or something like that. Gods, something, I don't know. Yes.
Right? So that's something we don't know, right? What they will see. So you need a word for machine and technology to see that object. You get that?
Yes, sir, I do. But sir, I got what you're trying to say. But then there are certain things that exist universally.
Yes, sir.
जैसे कि everybody feels angry, right? So if suppose कि we would not have this word called angry या गुस्सा in our vocabulary, then also we would feel some sort of disturbance inside us, and we would eventually classify it as, you know, and as we have already.
As
We have,
something.
yes, but the
But
idea of
this feeling that you describe as angry can be described by some other word in the different way, right?
yes,
And that feeling may or may not be exactly the same as yours. That's भी possible होता है ना?
yes,
Right? So where do that leave us? Another example. Say for example, there is a language which does not have a shade. This does not describe a color for lavender or mauve, right? So would those people see the same colors as you do?
no, so they'd probably call it purple. I don't know.
If that word exists in that language, a closest word equivalent to that. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So basically what we see is determined by the structure of our language. Taken to extreme, what Mallarmé is saying was taken to extreme by certain anthropologists called Edward Sapid and Benjamin Lee Whorf. These two linguists took this idea to extremes, and they said that all social reality is found in, is determined by our language. Language determines our experiential reality, right? And Sapir-Whorf would give an example of a tribe from Africa called Hopi, H-O-P-I. And they point out that there is no structure for past perfect in their language. That means their uncle died. You cannot express that. It will be something like uncle is dying. उसके चाचा तो मर गए, फिर भी वो अगर कहना चाहे तो चाचा मर रहे हैं, ऐसा कुछ कहना पड़ेगा. So their perception of past is very different from perception of past that you have. For example, in English, there are only two tenses for the verb, right? Yes, no? English has only 2 tenses, right?
Yes.
But
Yes.
Gujarati has 3. Hindi has 3. 3 word forms describing past, present, and future. So the perception of past, present, and future is very often determined by the structure of language that we are using. Is what Sapir and Worf would go on to point out. And they would also give an example that, say, for example, Eskimos have 20 words to describe shades of white in snow. These words हैं उनके लिए to describe various shades of snow. But in English, we have ice and snow or white, off-white, right? Dirty white or whatever. So you will have a different perception. You won't see those shades which Eskimos can see and talk about. So to perceive and articulate reality, language plays a very important role. So you may not go as much as Sapir and Worf, and I don't go there, that language shapes your reality. I would only say that language influences your perception to large extent of your reality, right? So your reality is shaped by language as much. So you are having another view of language where reality is a creation of your language. Does that help you? So reality is created. So poetry does not imitate reality, but create reality. So that's what is Mallarmé is suggesting. Anyone has any questions about this? So you can see 20th century thinking about language is influenced by symbolists. And today cognitive theorists are criticizing this symbolist view of language. And they are arguing about certain basic fundamentals of language which are determined by our neurological structures. So they talk about embodied perception. So meaning is not merely that is produced by language. Right, they are having a cognitivist view of semantics. It's called cognitive semantics. क्या स्तवन क्या पूछ रहा है? What's your question, Stavan? So language even creates reality, right? Correct. Very good. Multilingual language also influences your perception. Very true. Jalta. Agreed. This is different from Chomsky's view, in the sense that Chomsky is talking about deep structures of a language. Language में universals है, ऐसे बोल रहा है. जैसे कि subject, verb, object, ये universal है. सभी languages दुनिया में उसको subject, verb और object रहते हैं. But cognitivists are saying that subject, verb, and object has basis in the neurological make of your brains and nervous system, while Mallarmé is saying that language is producing your realities. And it does resemble, in my view, Kant's view that our perception is given by our cognition. Reality is shaped by our cognitive mechanism. So reality does not exist independently. Time and space does not exist independently of our cognitive processes. That's what I think has parallels with Mallarmé. Then where is the source of that language? आपको क्या लगता है स्तवन, कहां से आती है लैंग्वेज? Yes, a priori cognitive faculty of Kant is like analogous to linguistic faculty of Mallarmé. Yes, that's what I feel. Okay, anyone has to ask something before we move ahead? Or human cognition, the device, like Chomsky said. And these two ideas are not very different. Linguistic acquisition device that Chomsky talks about. And I think people are getting bored with our discussion of linguistics. हमने linguistics भी चला दिया लगे आज. Philosophy तो चला ही देते हैं, साथ में linguistics भी चला दिया हमने. तो लिटरेरी, तो आप जब इंग्लिश सब्जेक्ट लेते हो तो सभी सब्जेक्ट्स आपको आते हैं, कोई और सब्जेक्ट लेने की जरूरत नहीं है, राइट? ओके, so where does language come from, Stavan? It comes from भगवान. यार भगवान को आप भूल जाते हो, स्तवन बहुत भूल जाते हो भगवान. Okay. Anyway, but what you have to get is that they are reacting against to laugh or to cry. What laugh or to cry? किस subject के बारे में?
Sir, about the fact that English encompasses everything. So now you have a lot to read, but you also know a lot, you find out a lot. So that is kind of a dual
Yeah.
stance.
Yes, and Stavan, God ऐसे directly नहीं कह रहा है, ये तो मैं कह रहा हूँ. मलार में ऐसे नहीं कह रहा है. मैं इसलिए वो गली में मैं जाना नहीं चाहता था. You know, there is something called originological fallacy in philosophy, that you want to find out origins of everything. Where does language come from? When did language originate? If you can ask this question, you will get a Nobel Prize. Stavan, Nobel Prize is waiting for you. जब मिल जाए ना, तब हमको भूल मत जाना हम लोगों को. Original searching for origins of everything may not lead you with very interesting outcomes always. Yeah. Okay. Page 491. What is important according to what is ये जल्दी आज भूख लगी है, नाश्ता नहीं किया क्या पता नहीं. स्तवन को पूछ रही है भगवान क्या है.
Sir, since he wants to find out origin of everything, पहले ये तो verify करो कि ये entity है क्या जिसकी हम बात कर रहे हैं.
तो उसके पर छोड़ देते हैं, हम जाते हैं आर्थर साइमंस के पास.
Sure, yes.
विटजेनस्टाइन ने ऐसे कुछ कहा था. Wittgenstein, another philosopher, says that those things which we cannot speak of, we should be silent. वो चीज के बारे में हम बोल नहीं सकते, उसके बारे में हम चुप रहे. तो मैं वहां पे चुप रह के सीधे आर्थर साइमंस के पास जाता हूँ. पेज 491 पे मुझे सिलेबस खत्म करना है, राइट? भगवान के बारे में सच्चाई ढूंढने के लिए हजारों साल से लोग प्रयत्न कर रहे हैं, उन्हें नहीं मिला क्योंकि उनको सिलेबस खत्म नहीं करना था TYTA का. Okay. What Simons is emphasizing, and this is very important, talking now that we have brought up God, right? Now that we have brought up God, we can't let him go. Simons is saying that it seems that art, right, and seems art and poetry seems to be displacing theology, according to Arthur Simons. And it's almost as if art and poetry is replacing religion, which is one of, religion being displaced by science and technology. What has happened is art is encroaching upon that space in the Western bourgeois thought. So that is something that you have to keep an eye for. Page 491, a trend that will continue, right? So okay. Another point, I think Grishma will have to mute her video. What effect did that place on human language? The shift from religion to science. Language sciences start becoming more and more important. So instead of theological understanding of language, Stavan, there was an effort made to have more scientific understanding of language, which resulted in the origins of modern linguistics. Grishma, please mute your video. You can just call her up or you can message her. Because she is not planning to serve us food in any way, so we don't want to look into her house. अगर वो खाना बना रही है हमारे लिए तो हम देखते नहीं. चलो.
I'm sorry, sir. I didn't know that.
Pardon?
I didn't know that my video was on.
No, if I thought that if you are planning to feed us something interesting, then we would have minded.
I'm so sorry.
So after Corona, maybe we'll come down to your house for food.
You're most welcome, sir. You're most welcome.
Okay, so page 491. This is an important point, right? So that tells us about symbolism, and one of the most important theorists that we are going to talk about of symbolism is Charles Baudelaire, and he was extremely inconsistent and contradictory because he did not have a kind of outlook towards criticism that characterizes people like Matthew Arnold or people like Kant or Hegel, right, who are great system builders. Charles Baudelaire was primarily a poet who wrote about art and place of art in life, very much like Poe, whom he greatly admired, right? But he was less systematic than Poe. But he also theorized or he reflected upon things which have become cornerstone of modernism as a movement. Page 492. Charles Baudelaire he is a precursor of modernist poetry, right? And what of T.S. Eliot and others, Ezra Pound and others. His collection of poems is La Fleur du Mal, or The Flowers of Evil, that came out in 1857, became a trial for obscenity because they included themes like lesbianism and all that. But he wrote things which were extremely shocking for the bourgeoisie or the middle class of his time. So here is a middle class bourgeoisie who wants to shock others bourgeoisie and take a contrarian position, right? Something which can put him under the category called heterological thinkers that Habib talks about, but he is not so much of a thinker as a writer. Unlike romantics, who talked about rustic life and ordinary people and the lower strata of society and democracy, and the romantics who believed in essential goodness of man, right? Baudelaire talked about urban life, sordidness, and saw human being as essentially depraved, something which can be connected to his own Catholic bringing. That man is basically a sinner, and that's why he has to be controlled. Something that goes against Rousseau's almost Protestant belief that man is born free everywhere he is in chains. So in these two important aspects, he is rejecting romanticism. Though some of the ideas of romanticism, like correspondences between this world and that world, something that Coleridge talks about, or the idea of imagination, is something that Baudelaire would accept primarily as his fundamental premise. But his outlook to life is very unromantic in the sense it talks about urban life. And one of the biggest problems of urban life, according to Baudelaire, is boredom. And boredom is not boredom with small b, which many of you in the class are experiencing right now. अभी आप जो बोर होते हो ना, वो आप सब्जेक्ट से बोर हो चुके हो. But boredom with capital B, right, is when you are bored of entire human and the existence of creation. It's a metaphysical state of boredom that, or what in French is called ennui. Ennui is the metaphysical state of boredom that Baudelaire thought is characteristic of modern man. नहीं, आप लोग तो पैंडेमिक से बोर हुए हो, आप सोशल मीडिया से बोर हुए हो, आप ऑनलाइन क्लासेस से बोर हुए हो. पर ennui is when the whole existence appears as boring to you, right? And that, according to Baudelaire, led man to sin. So all the sins that you find of modern urban life, and all of them were something in which Baudelaire himself indulged, right, were sins of boredom. Yes, existential in nature, very true. So his own life is characterized by bohemian lifestyle. Whatever money he had inherited from his rich father, he all squandered it on drugs, prostitution, and whatnot, and kind of luxuries that they could not afford. And finally, he died of syphilis, or sexually transmitted disease that he got from one of his mistresses. His collection of poems have this kind of, I think it's a poem called Jewels, I'm not very sure, which talks about how he is making love to his mistress, but she dies in his arms and her body starts to rot. And it becomes a dead carcass only with the jewels left. ऐसी एक poem है उसकी. Let me see if it's the same poem. So, Baudelaire, yeah, I think this is the one. All the links are banned on this computer. Anyway, it's called the Jewels. You can look up in your Google. So kind of romanticism that Baudelaire brought in. Anna aa gayi. How are you, Anna?
Yes, sir. A lot better. Mom and I are a lot better. We might get discharged in a day or two.
Yeah. And why your health is improving, you know? Because you have read poems by Baudelaire. उसके सामने कोरोना टिक नहीं सकता.
टिक नहीं सकता.
Okay, get well soon.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So you can look up these poems online, the jewels.
I found it.
Yes,
So do I send it in the group or do I not?
you can.
Okay.
Okay, so why we brought this up is because he introduced a kind of aesthetics which are, though being romantic, are not romantic, right? And unlike romanticists like Wordsworth, who had great sympathy for the poor and the downtrodden and the illiterate and the villagers, Baudelaire was outright aristocratic in his values. So the value system that he seems to promote is aristocracy. So putting him on the political spectrum, he would be on the side of aristocrats in French revolutions, right? Unlike Wordsworth and Coleridge and others who would be on the side of the, the, the rebels, right? So he is a conservative out and out. His theory, one of his theories found in his very famous poem called Correspondences, which seems to kind of echo of Coleridge and Neoplatonicism, which says that this world is a forest of symbols. So this tree that you see, the cloud that you see, all these are forests of symbols. And the meaning lies in the other world, some other world, reminding you of Neoplatonic view that is important to symbolism. And unlike the modern belief, growing belief, especially that you found in not Henry James, in Howells, that criticism should become more and more scientific and detached. Something that you found in Kant, who said that your criticism should be deeply disinterested. Baudelaire promotes the view that it should be biased, impassioned, and partisan. It should not be disinterested and unbiased. It should be biased, impassioned, and partisan, taking parts, sides. And he goes on to say on page 493 in his book called Salon, an essay called Salon, which he says that best criticism is that which is amusing and poetic, not a cold mathematical criticism which deliberately divests itself of every kind of temperament. His views on romanticism are ambivalent. They keep on switching. So on one hand, he would admire some aspects of modernism, but then, like modernism, he would oppose modernism in some of the key ideas that we discussed, like the belief in essential goodness of man, or in rustic and village life. Instead of that, you deal with things which are terrifying, right? Yet beautiful and urban. His ideas about morality also seem to be ambivalent. So on one hand, he seems to deny that art has any moral substance or moral purpose to it. And his influence is definitely coming from Edgar Allan Poe, whom he translated and admired. He thought that Poe is promoting a kind of aristocratic view, which this bourgeois, decadent, commercial people will never understand. So he saw Poe as a kind of misfit in the society, and he could identify himself with that. He is also something that which is very important for our understanding of Baudelaire. I'm not very sure of Wilde being influenced by Baudelaire. I'm not sure. Hoga, I have not looked it up. Maybe you can look up and tell us. Jaldi. His views about realism, and I will stop there, right? are also ambivalent in the sense that he sees realism as rustic, coarse, dishonest, and even boorish. And then he says that every good poetry is always realistic, not because it reflects the reality in front of you, but it reflects the reality of another world, Neoplatonic world. And the present world is merely a dictionary of hieroglyphics, page 493. So, two important points of symbolism is one, that language is not inherently referential, right? Or something called Cratylitean. Cratylus is a dialogue in which Plato defines language as something which names the objects. And it is a kind of pointing. Language is all about pointing. So symbolic view of language sees language as referring to something else other than itself. And secondly, the idea of reality that you have in front of you is not reality. And this is where it goes into the tunnel created by Plato, that what exists is not reality. It exists, but it's not real. Reality lies elsewhere. For Plato, it lies in the domain of reason, but for Baudelaire and symbolists, it lies in the domain of imagination. Right? This is where they separate from Plato. Okay, so let's stop here. Let's take a break and we'll meet at 2:45 after your class. What class do you have?
Course 16, Madhurita ma'am, poetry.
Okay, so after that we'll meet. But now this also helps you to see, one of the things that you should be doing is making connections across your syllabus, right? So symbolist and romantic theories of literature and poetry, you should be able to relate to the poems that you read, right, in your poetry classes. I think this is what you should be doing. राइट और जो लिटरेरी हिस्ट्री में आपने पढ़ा था उसका कनेक्शन भी इसके साथ करना है आपको. सो क्रिटिसिज्म कैन बी कनेक्टेड टू लिटरेरी हिस्ट्री. यू कैन आल्सो कनेक्ट इट टू द हिस्ट्री ऑफ लैंग्वेज. यू कैन आल्सो कनेक्ट इट टू poetry and novels that you study. That is what you are supposed to do. That connection actually shows that you have understood your subject. Right, so let's take a break for now and meet after 1 hour. Any questions before that? किसी को अभी जो हमने बोला वो कुछ doubts है, कुछ समझ में नहीं आया?
Sir, it's not a doubt really or anything like that, but I realize I'm being repetitive, but would you please check if my name is in the list of exams or not, so that I should...
It's there, but I will let you know. मैं अभी देख लेता हूँ.
so that I should know कि...
है, लगभग तो है ही.
हाँ. All right, let's start.
But I will doubly confirm.
Yes, thank you, sir.
Okay. हाँ, we'll have to read to ask. वही बात है सब पूरी. Yes, thank you, all of you.